So welcome everyone to the 25th monthly online guest lecture organized by the research scholars at the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies. We are honored to have you join us today. Our distinguished speaker for this enlightening session is Professor Stephan Günzel. He will delve into the captivating topic of philosophy of space. Before we commence, a gentle reminder. This event is being recorded. Kindly ensure that your microphones remain muted throughout the lecture, which is expected to last approximately 60 minutes. Following the lecture, we'll have Q&A session where you can interact directly with our speaker. Now I invite Ms. Sandra for the welcome address.
Thank you, Diksha. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Good afternoon, everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Stephan Günzel. Professor Günzel holds the position of Professor of Media Theory and Cultural Theory at the University of Europe for Applied Sciences in Berlin. He has been directing the Institute for Design Research and the MA program, New Media Design, since 2011. With a passion for exploring the realm of space, image, and digital media, Professor Günzel has made significant contribution to the field. He is also actively involved in various academic conferences and workshops, including the Philosophy of Computer Games conference series and the Ludotopia workshop series alongside the renowned Espen Arsat. We are here eagerly anticipating his insights into the philosophy of space during the guest lecture today at the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies. We welcome you, sir. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to Goa. Unfortunately, only remote, but hopefully one day we also will meet in physical space.
Yeah, my topic is the philosophy of space, or in the plurality, the philosophy of spaces. As already been announced in the introduction, my background is in media studies, game philosophy. I originally was a student of philosophy, so that's actually where my roots are, and I keep that up to today. And even when it comes then to the very broad topic of space itself, the reason why I like to speak about games in the context of philosophy is not for the games themselves, but I think they can shed a pretty good light on the possibilities of thinking varieties of spatial concepts. Keep it very briefly. And since they've been the very first accessible simulations, it is probably one of the easiest objects to talk about when it comes to digital media. But we can leave that also open for the discussion. My talk actually has three main parts. The first one's going to be like providing like a general common ground based in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant and his idea of space as a form of intuition, from which I want to switch to the more current debate about the spatial turn, and then finally return to a discussion of computer games with the help of a not so famous French philosopher whose name is Henri Lefebvre, and who has been basically the godfather of contemporary thinking about space. But let's start with an easy question. What is philosophy? I guess you as scholars and students of philosophy have asked you that many times yourself, and there are a lot of answers out there. Personally, my favorite answer to that was given by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari in a book that is exactly named, what is philosophy. But this is not our topic today, because they are pretty much every philosopher has his or her own idea about what philosophy is. So let's be a bit more specific. Is there something like a general topic that philosophy is treating, no matter what the diversity in the different approaches is? And yeah, there are quite some. That's why we also have the different branches like ethics and moral philosophy, or aesthetics. But basically, one of the most traditional forms of philosophy is epistemology, or the question about truth. And that is very important for talking about space, because usually when it comes to discussion of what is space, people start arguing about the true nature of space. So we also see a close relation to physics, and for a long time, at least until the modern age, philosophy and physics have basically been identical, or physics being a part of philosophy itself. But if we look into the more modern philosophical discourse, we also very early find notions that it is actually not philosophy's task or assignment to decide what is true and what is not true, but to provide frameworks that define what are the condition of possibilities of truth. So this is a very narrow definition now of what philosophy is doing or what philosophy is about, but it's also a very famous one, a prominent one, because that is rooted in the critical philosophy of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant and his infamous critique of pure reason from 1789, at least the first issue from 1781, first issue, and in which he, in the very first part after the introduction, namely the transcendental aesthetics, talks about space. You might know that, so here's like a little repetition or a brief intro if you're not familiar with that. So Kant defines, against the discourse of his time, space as not an object or as matter, but as he calls it, a form of intuition. And by that he means that space is a subjective form. It is not subjective in the sense as we use the term nowadays, that it varies from individual to individual, but that it is the same for each subject. That's also why he defines space as a transcendental form. By that, arguing against the English empiricism, he considers space also not to be an empirical instance or matter or just a physical object. This also suggests the idea that space itself is innate, that we are born with that subjective transcendental form, even though in that particular context, he tries also to avoid the term of space being innate. Rather, he uses the term a priori, which means that space itself cannot be observed or empirically measured, but is the precondition of our perception and the creation of knowledge. And that is important for my further line of argument, because I'm not want to stick with Immanuel Kant only, but I'm suggesting that the a priori itself has multiple variations, and that the form itself, as Michel Foucault probably would call it, the a priori itself is historical. Maybe to just close the presentation, or to sum up what Kant's concept of space in the critique of pure reason is in total. That is actually something that caused a lot of trouble in the spatial discourse until today, because he then also differentiates further within the transcendental aesthetics between space being the an outer sense opposed to time as the inner sense, by which he separates the idea of the form of extension and the form of movement by estimating time to be the sense that is much closer to the very being or nature of the human intellect, and thus the further discourse, at least until the spatial turn in the late 20th century, favored time always over space. So that's a pretty bad thing about Kant, or something I don't suggest to adopt, but let's stick with the idea of the form of intuition, no matter if you want to call it an outer space or an outer form or an inner form. In Neo-Kantianism, which took place in mid till late 19th century after the, let's say, the rise of Hegelianism and Neo-Kantianism in Europe, and especially in Germany. Sorry for sticking to German philosophers in that first part. A lot of physiologists and researchers started to look for space as a form of intuition that is given to us prior of any experience. And what they discovered is something that all of us share, so it's subjectively common ground. And this is the part of the inner ear that is not devoted to hearing, but to spatial orientation. And for some reason, that organ, the inner ear, or these semicircular three-dimensional construct, has three directions, or points at least in three directions. Hence, those people in the 19th century started to believe that the idea of geometrical space, that is space derived from the geometry of Euclid, is also the way space is given to us through our perception, because of that organ that was discovered after Kant claimed that space is the a priori form of intuition. And one of these physiologists that were inspired by the discovery of this organ of space was Ernst Mach, an Austrian scientist whom after the sound of speed was named. That's why you might know the name Mach. And in his book, The Analysis of Sensation from 1886, he provides this great drawing, maybe the most philosophical portrait ever created. It's only one of the few ones ever really created as a painting or drawing by philosophers, I have to admit. I think there are only two out there. The other one is by Wittgenstein. But the great thing about Ernst Mach's idea of the self-portrait is actually that he is thinking the self-portrait in terms of what we nowadays would call a selfie. But not in the way that we make the camera point at us, but that we try to include hints that actually we took the photo. In a more narrow sense, this is what people are calling footsies. So if you stretch out on the beach and you take a photo including your legs, then this is this particular form of a selfie. And Ernst Mach, this philosopher and scientist, he claimed that the real nature of spatial perception is actually our embodied perception, and also that we only partially can have a visual impression of our own body. If you can't decipher this image, actually you can see his mustache in the lower part of the picture, then the legs or the body stretched out on this chaiselong, and looking at the window, and the right-hand side is actually holding the pen. For us nowadays, especially in media philosophy, those last two elements are maybe even more important than the idea of the philosophical self-portrait in being located in space, because the hand holding the pen is a pretty absurd or actually a paradox element of that picture, because that pen is supposed to just been drawing the image we are looking at, but the image itself is not included in the image because we are looking at the image. So it would create what philosophers call this in regressum infinitum, so this eternal repetition of the same basis. And the other element that is important and that gives us a critical perspective on that concept of space coming from Kantian philosophy is the window in the back. Because as you might know, in the European tradition, the window is the very metaphor for the realistic image running from Renaissance painting until today's photography. The idea of the open window was coined by Leon Battista Alberti, an Italian painter in the 15th century, and has the first time thoroughly been criticized in cultural studies and philosophy of art and media by Ernst Panofsky in his book on the perspective as symbolic form, being inspired again by another philosopher. So I'm just dropping them names here, but if you're familiar with them, they might be very telling. That is Ernst Cassirer, who published 3 volumes in the early 20th century on the philosophy of symbolic forms, and basically was the inventor of philosophy as cultural philosophy, also a forerunner of modern day structuralism, because he, just like Foucault and others later on, or Lévi-Strauss, he was thinking of different cultural settings having their own rationality, and no rationality has to be valued higher than any other. And Panofsky, adopting that idea, criticizing Alberti, says, well, our particular form of paintings, but furthermore of our concept of space, is derived from linear perspective, Renaissance paintings, and has become our very idea, or the basis of the very idea of what space is looking like, or the formation of space, or the form, the very form of intuition, as Kant would say. So this is actually what is at stake, and I'm not claiming that this is not a possible truth of space, but it is not the only truth of space. And this is also where computer games are becoming philosophically relevant, because computer games are very good in providing simulations of different concepts of space. Not deliberately all the time. Sometimes game designers don't reflect very much which kind of engine they are using or which spatial construct they are working on. But at least we can see the variety throughout this rich history of computer games. If you are familiar with computer games, you probably know that the so-called 3D computer games had a rise in the 1990s. The 1990s allowed for real-time renderings of 3D geometrical spaces from a subjective point of view, which means they are very close to actually what Ernst Mach, after Immanuel Kant, was conceptualizing as space, or experienced space, as perceived space. And just like in Mach's drawing, instead of holding a pen, we are now holding a gun and pointing not always towards a window, but at least towards the point of flight. So no matter what the image offers us at particular objects or enemies, usually they're very hostile games, but the spatial construct itself is what for a long time people have assumed in philosophy to be the truth of space. And this is one of my favorite media artists from Berlin, contemporary artists who made fun of this idea that actually the true nature of space is this subjective perspective, and he created this first-person shooter do-it-yourself glasses that you can wear and obviously cannot focus both at the same time, not the hands holding the gun and what you are aiming at. So he's not only criticizing this idea of perceived space as just one form of space, but he's also criticizing or highlighting the fact that whenever we look at images, we can see distant points and objects being closer to us the same time. So that's also a hint at the fact that images that try to reproduce what we are actually perceiving are can be misleading, because they allow for, let's say, this simultaneous perception of foreground and background. Aram Bartholm, the media artist I just mentioned, he's not the first one to criticize linear perspective and implicitly also the philosophical concept of space in the Western tradition. But we have this Englishman here, William Hogarth, who was a painter in the 18th century, and he created a satire on false perspective, as he calls it. So we can see in the upper right corner the whole drawing or engraving, and here is a detail that we are looking at. And that detail demonstrates that that you can actually fool people by using linear perspective, because it makes them expect to read the image, the two-dimensional image, as a three-dimensional space. But because it's just a flat object, you can place things anywhere you want, and you can create these paradoxes like he did, this fisherman holding the rope. Obviously, because of the size of that man standing closer to the spectator, but the actually rope is behind the other fisherman in the back, and the whole image is created out of these spatial paradoxes. So that is I guess in philosophy we nowadays would call it a deconstruction. So it's a deconstruction, a visual deconstruction, but it's also a philosophical deconstruction of the underlying concept. Interestingly, in simulations or computer games, we can make use of such paradoxes or impossible spaces, like, for example, this Japanese game Echochrome did. It, in the literal sense, provides us with what you see is what you get. So no matter where we assume that, or where we would assume which part of that space is closer or further away from us, as soon as it aligns on screen, a contact is made in the virtual space, and the task of the game, what players have to find out, is how to provide a pathway for that avatar that you can see in that space. I think this example is much more telling. So if that gap is hidden in plain sight, then the pathway is connected. So that's also deconstruction of linear perspective. If we look into non-European cultures, imagery, concepts of space, for example, in medieval China, we can find drawing styles. So this is a kind of a panorama painting about 5 meters wide. Although I'm hesitant to call it a panorama, because a panorama is an French and English intervention in the tradition of linear perspective, providing a 360 view, realistic in terms of the open window. Whereas this Chinese painting here provides a so-called isometric perspective. That is an oblique perspective looking from a side onto space, and there is no defined singular point of view from which space is witnessed. I guess with Panofsky, we could ask the question, what is the symbolic expression of that spatial construct? And maybe just as the symbolic meaning or expression of linear perspective is, I am subject. Here, the symbolic meaning or expression is every good, every person, even every bit of nature belongs to the emperor, seen in the same perspective, and all the objects or people are alike. No matter what the interpretation is. So, and I said, philosophy is not in the first place about revealing truth itself, but thinking about the possibility or possibilities of truth. So we find games, very popular games, worldwide, but the origin very much in Asia, Eastern Asia especially. Games that use an oblique perspective, just like medieval Chinese paintings, and you don't have a singular point of view, but you have this oblique perspective on the game space. World of Warcraft is a famous example, but also more contemporary League of Legends. If you know those games, you know what I'm talking about. If not, I guess my explanation is also helpful, or what at least you could tell here is that this is not a linear projection, a linear perspective in terms of, in a style of Renaissance paintings. Or another cultural context, Persian miniatures, this palace scene from the 16th century, which is at least, for me at first glance, it was like almost impossible to understand or to read or to interpret. But the longer you look at it and the more information you gather, you see that the underlying principle or connecting principle behind it is that each room or each space that is an interior is depicted the same way as an exterior space. Again, we can think about the cultural context. So does it have to do with the climate situation in Persia? So the inside space without a rooftop, but like the inner yard keeps out the sunlight. So it's the same time an inner space plus an outer space. But it leads definitely to this particular form of depicting space. And we can find that in modern simulations in the context of computer games as well. This is not an animation, but it is an upright screen game for mobile devices. The game is called Monument Valley, and just like in the game Echochrome I showed you, you have to find or create the connection between pathways. So it works a little bit like the black and white game I showed you. But what you can also do, and these two screenshots are about to demonstrate that, is that you can turn or can swap the inside for an outside. So you turn around the building or the architecture, and you can have what used to be the hidden inside becomes the outside, and by that you can access different pathways. So that, I mean, basically, this is also an isometric perspective that I agree. So it's probably even a mixture between a Chinese and a Persian concept of space. But it's one of the games that actually does demonstrate this equalness of inside and outside. Or these kind of images from Orthodox Christianity. Greece and regions of Russia. This painting by Rublev, the Holy Trinity. At first glance, it looks pretty much like linear perspective, but if you look at details, especially the footrests we can see in the lower part of the picture, we can see that the point of flight, where the parallel lines converge, is actually not in the back of the pictorial space, but more or less where we are as spectators are located. So it's swapping the location of the subject, and or we could say the space itself is looking at us. And there are also simulations that try to play with the swapping of perspectives. So this is a game, or a prototype, has never been turned into a proper game, by a media artist, Julian Oliver from Australia, who locates the me in the space we are looking at, and the opponent or the enemy, the you, at the place from which we are looking. This, if you're familiar with the phenomenological discourse, this is more or less a way to find a solution to what Edmund Husserl called the problem of the alter ego. That is, how from a phenomenological point of view you can get an insight to the existence of the other. All right, this more or less was like the first and the beginning of the second part. Don't worry, I'm also watching my clock here, and now comes the most central theory I'd like to introduce to you, namely the theory of Henri Lefebvre. But to close the first part, here's another quote by Immanuel Kant, this time not from the Critique of Pure Reason, but from a less famous paper on a discovery whereby any new critique of pure reason is to be made superfluous by an older one from 1790, and in which he now uses the term of space being innate, but he says what particular aspect of space is the one that he considers innate. And he says only the possibility of the intuition of space, that in German is Raumanschauung, is innate, not the spatial representation, Raumvorstellung itself. So we do have the possibility to perceive space, but that particular way in which we perceive space, that doesn't seem to be fixed. And this is a notion that was considered to be a forerunner of what later on was called an insight into non-Euclidean geometry, meaning that a triangle on a sphere or any hyperbolic object has less or more than 180 degrees of a triangle in flat Euclidean space. Keeping in mind that one of the most famous examples for the a priori truth in Kant is the triangle and the sum of the 180 degrees within any possible triangle. But here it seems that he is much more pluralistic than he's often understood. I think I keep these bits on more possibilities on how to conceptualize space in philosophy for our discussion. Maybe you know some philosophers like Michel Desartaux or Martin Heidegger or others that we can actually have a look at in the discussion hereafter. What I now want to do is make you familiar, introduce a more recent philosopher from France who came up with an idea of space or a concept or a framework of thinking spatiality that to me is the most universal framework. The inventor of that framework is Henri Lefebvre. You might not have heard the name, but you probably know his most famous student, who was Jean Baudrillard, the simulation theorist who became also the inspiration for the Matrix movies. Henri Lefebvre was a very productive writer, and he almost published, or at least published, one book per year. He's not a great author, so those books are not really very well readable. But some of them are actually very important, I think, for the philosophical discourse. One recommendation of mine is meta-philosophy. So it is an approach to think about different approaches in philosophy from a meta perspective. But for our context, the important book is La Production de l'Espace in French, published already in 1974, but only translated into English in 1991. And when it was published in the 70s in France, nobody really got the idea what he's talking about. How could space be a product? How can it be produced? How can it be man-made? Because space immediately also was associated with the idea of outer or endless space. But Lefebvre in particular was talking about urban spaces and the way city spaces are structured, reconstructed or restructured, also by governments. That is what he was interested in. He was inspired a lot by the psychogeographic movement, Guy Debord and other Marxists. But the book, Production of Space, only became a bestseller, so to speak, or quoted and referenced after it was translated into English in 1991 into the Production of Space. And one of the catalysts, so to speak, or one of the readers of Henri Lefebvre was Edward Sosha, a social geographer with a high interest in philosophical concepts. And he, in his book Third Space, adopted the core concept of spatiality from Lefebvre. You might know the term third space. That is actually a term Sosha borrowed or stole from Homi Bhabha, who used it for the hybridity of cultures meeting, mixing, or being in conflict. What Sosha is using it for is to describe that with Lefebvre, space is not just one thing, or there's not just one truth of space, but we do have at least three different aspects of space. And those three aspects are called the perceived, the lived, and the conceived. And if we are looking much closer to what they are about, I'm also here providing the French original wording because sometimes this is a bit confusing in the English translation. It's already confusing in the French wording, but it might be helpful for those reading or understanding French. And plus, what makes Lefebvre's concept of space challenging is that these three elements or perspectives or modalities of space themselves are then doubled. They are once described with a phenomenological terminology and then with a semiotic terminology. So semiotic being the studies of signs or reference or representation, whereas phenomenology is the study or the description of human sense-mediated perception or experience. So the differentiation that takes place is the one between spatial practice, representations of space, and representational spaces. The first one, the spatial practice, probably the easiest to understand. This is where Ernst Mach would locate the human body because it is perceiving space from its own subjective perspective. And in this kind of space, we also assume that the space is physically real because we can touch it, we can smell it, and so forth. But there is a different level of space, not necessarily above or after it, can be also be prior to spatial experience, and that is the representation of space. That could be a picture, a photograph, a literal description. It could be a poetic text about space. It could be an architectural drawing. It could be just a calculation from algebra or a drawing from geometry. All those kinds are called by Lefebvre representations of space. And this is the way we think space, or how we conceive space. That's where I also, in the narrow sense, would locate the philosophic, or not the philosophical concepts of space, but the concept of space we predominantly find in physics when they claim to be a true representations of space. What is important for Lefebvre is that he takes this level very seriously. He says this contributes as much to our understanding of space as the perception of space. And maybe just to give you an example, what Zoja book is mainly about, he tells us that most of the ideas about, let's say, spaces, or at least locations, we do have from movies or TV series. So I've been to India, but I've never been to Goa, but I've seen images or pictures of Goa. So I have already an idea of how Goa might look like. And when I get there, I probably try to adopt my perception or find an agreement between what I expected and what I'm actually perceiving. So, and this dialectics, this transformation of spatial understanding, this is an ongoing process to Lefebvre. Now comes the third level, and this is the hardest to understand. And this is what he calls, or at least the translation calls, the representational space, which is collectively lived. And here we get a confusion at least in two respects. On the one hand, why is that level lived and not the first one where we perceive space? Well, the idea is that is something that is more a social aspect. So people commonly share an experience of space as lived space. But in what way does this representational space differ from the representation of space? And here Lefebvre himself, or his text, is not very helpful. That's why in my abstract that I sent you, are referring to a third philosopher to build my argument. So the first one was Immanuel Kant. The second one now is Henri Lefebvre. But the third one that I want to use here, even though he hardly has anything to do with the spatial discourse or the philosophy of space, and usually is not quoted in that context, is the US-American philosopher Nelson Goodman, who was a philosopher of art and philosopher of language. So he's from the tradition of analytic philosophy, and especially his book about facts and fiction or fictional worlds is a famous reading. But probably his most famous book is a lecture series on the languages of art, an approach to a theory of symbols, as the subtitle says. And this is very important because Nelson Goodman here, not only as the cover tells us, provides us with a great definition of a philosophical definition of what is the difference between the analog and the digital. That could also be important for our topic, but what is even more important is he provides us with two different understandings of symbols or of representations. And he's a follower of Charles Sanders Peirce semiotics, and Charles Sanders Peirce was, at least the late Peirce, all about pragmatism. So his idea is that we use signs constitutes not only the meaning, but also what is the particular nature of a sign that we are using. And he now, Goodman, is differentiating between two kinds of representations. And those I want to use to give an explanation of what the different kinds of representation of space in Lefebvre are, even though Lefebvre is not mentioning Goodman, and I think also Goodman never studied Lefebvre, even though they were productive in the same age or same time. But as we know, this was the period when there was hardly no exchange or confrontation between analytic and continental philosophy. Anyhow, the most famous or common way we understand representation is in an asymmetrical way. This is how, let's say, early analytic philosophy, including the early Wittgenstein, is considering language to be a representation of facts. We could question what is meant by fact, but at least what the logic we create while using language is a representation of that set of things we are referring to within the use of language. Or to put it more simple, especially nouns that we are using, like glass, the term glass is referring to an object. And then if the object is present, we can say the claim is true, there is a glass on the table, or it's not true. This representation only works in one direction. Hence, that's the reason why Goodman is calling it an asymmetrical representation. The term refers to the object, but the object is not referring to that noun in language. And this is not only because we have in different languages different words for that object, but also because the objects themselves, they are not semiotically active. However, we can develop or have developed a pragmatic or pragmatics in which we can use those objects to become signs themselves. And this is what Goodman calls an exemplification. So, and that means if I broke several of the glasses from my shelf and I have only one left, but I like them so much that I want more of them, I go to the shop. Most of the glasses probably are from IKEA. And I bring that glass and show it to the people at the store, and I tell them, I need more of those. So I use that object to refer to another object, but both objects belong to the same set of things. That is why the object it is referring to also refers back, at least when I use it as a referent, to that object I used originally to designate the object that I want to refer to. And this is basically giving an example. And this way of using signs as or representing things or facts by Goodman is called an exemplification. And it works in both directions. So this is now important to keep in mind when we think about Lefebvre, because in my understanding, this is the essential difference between a representation of space and a representational space. So the representation of space means we have created drawings, photographs, descriptions of spaces we already perceived, or we will perceive, or we might never perceive. And they're referring to it in terms of a denotation. Whereas representational spaces are spaces that are an example for spaces that are alike. They belong to the same set of spatialities. I guess most of the spatial descriptions we find in Michel Foucault, like the study of the prison very famously, are an interpretation of representational spaces. Because Foucault, if you know Discipline and Punish, his book about the panopticism, so Bentham's prison, the panopticon, is not itself interesting as the very physical space, which was only built, I think, 2 or 3 times. But the structure that we can witness while looking at that particular prison construction can be found in many places, namely surveillance structures. Or let's take a traditional classroom or a lecture hall. Usually you have somebody standing in front near to the board, writing, talking, reading, and people sitting in the audience and listening. Also, our online lecture here has a certain spatial setting, even though some people would not call this a space. I understand that, but I don't share that thought. So it is about identical or similar structures that refer to each other, or that we can interpret as spaces that are configured or structured alike. And they are, in the terms of Lefebvre, they are representational spaces. And now here comes the, let's say the way I want to make use of philosophical concepts and computer games as illustrations of possible spaces. Because if we not stick to the idea that philosophy itself has to be has to deliver a true representation of space, we can look into the rich history of philosophical concepts and treat them as possible representational spaces. That means the way a philosopher describes spatiality has a structural similarity to other spaces, either description of spaces or physically built spaces. Just to give you again an example from Foucault, he claims that even the inspiration, but he doesn't use the word, but there's a structural similarity between people that during the period of the Black Death in Europe were separated, were isolated from the people in the city space. And this separation of people later on became the separation between the sane and the insane. That is from these early studies of Foucault. And he said this is structurally similar to René Descartes' concept of res extensa and res cogitans, because all the intellect is in the res cogitans, whereas all the matter is on the side of the res extensa. So the question here is not, was Descartes right in claiming that strict separation between mind and body, or mind and world, but that in a particular context, he described a representational space that we can find in many aspects or settings of the cultural world. And yeah, maybe just for the remaining 10 minutes, I can give you some examples, again, coming from the context of computer games or simulations. And again, not for the sake of computer games themselves, but for demonstrating in which way we can think of philosophies not being true representations of space or denotations, but exemplifications of possible spaces that might never be true, might never have been true, or that still are thought about. In the introduction to my lecture today, this book or workshop series was mentioned. So if you want to dive more into what's coming now, and I can only give you like a short insight of around about 10 minutes, this is a free access publication that you can find online. And if you want to know about philosophies of computer games, especially when it comes to spatiality, then this might be a reading for you. At least my contribution to it is dealing with this examples here. Sorry, let me just turn off the audio. So I guess if you ever played a computer game, you at least might know Tetris. But I don't know if you ever wondered about what kind of space Tetris is exemplifying. You even might not know what story Tetris is trying to tell us. At least it is the original author of the game actually was trying to depict a glass that spills over, and we need to prevent it from overflowing. But what Tetris does in its very spatial construction, it has designated or assigned locations within space for the objects to be placed in. And this is why, if we would consider the true nature of space to be Newtonian space, that means an empty space or a void through which objects travel with the same speed as long as there is no friction, the game Tetris would not work. So if real gravitation or physics in the sense of Newton were at work, this is an almost impossible game to play. What Tetris does instead is it provides us with an Aristotelian view of space. And Aristotle described space as topos. So because aside form and matter, or form and substance, he believed that each object, and that includes also the elements, even air, has a place. And whenever we move one thing from A to B, they are not moving continuously in physical space, but they are swapping places. This is the concept of Aristotelian space, and this is something we can find in Tetris, and something that let us allow to play the game successfully. Again, I'm not claiming that Pachitno, who created that game, the Russian designer, thought of an Aristotelian space, and also because of design limitations, he probably has chosen that particular way of constructing or simulating space. But if we ask the question, what kind of space does this game exemplify, I am pretty much convinced that this is an Aristotelian space. One opponent of Newton was the German mathematician Leibniz, who we can see here in the image on the left-hand side, who shortly before Immanuel Kant was creating philosophies. The concept of the monad is a very famous Leibnizian concept. But he also believed that with a pure mathematical approach to space, we can have a much more fruitful description of what space is. So he was an antagonist of Newton and didn't believe in the concept of absolute space or space as void. He came up with the concept of relational space. He believed that space can easily described as just the connection or relation between different locations. And the Seven Bridges of Königsberg is not only a name of this mobile game here, but it's also a name of a famous problem that the mathematician Gauss used to solve when he found out that people living in the city of Königsberg trying to cross the seven bridges we can see here in the image of the city and return to the place of origin and use all the seven bridges once. And nobody found a solution to that. And that inspired Gauss, coming from Leibniz, to use that mathematical description of space that later on was called topology. Again, we could argue whether topological space is a truthful description of space or not. But it is a way to exemplify spatial structures that we can also use to play with. Again, not claiming that people who created those spaces or people using them are always aware of what spatial structure they find themselves in. This is a game probably that make you very dizzy. It is a free running game in which you need to navigate through space by following those lines or highlighted objects. even though you can describe the space also as a Newtonian space, because you can move freely through empty space or the void, it tries to make you to follow that certain pathway. And space as a pathway has been a way the philosopher and psychologist Kurt Lewin at the beginning of the 20th century described space as hodological space. So he believed that humans never experience fully a Newtonian or Euclidean space, like we can see in that drawing on the left, that is a drawing by Lewin. So the connection or the distance between A and B to humans is not the shortest distance as it is in the Euclidean space, but it is always the way that we are forced to take. That could be a D route. It could be a straight line. It could be the closest connection, but it usually isn't. So just think of your daily routines, which ways or which pathways you are following. And this game, Mirror's Edge, is taking this to the extreme. And I would say with Lefebvre, it is exemplifying a philosophical notion of space as hodological space. I don't need to go into details again. Here I already explained that. So also the phenomenologically favorable description of space as this egocentric space is just one way to exemplify space. It is not the very nature of the very true concept of space. It's just a possibility. I've showed you the Hogarthian egochrome space with the false perspective or the satire of space. That is also a possible conceptualization and exemplification of space. And we could go on and on. Maybe I quit my lecture or finish my lecture with that game here. It's also my favorite game and a strong recommendation to try it out, because it's probably the only way in which we will ever be able to live in a four-dimensional space. This game is called Portal, and what you have to do if you have to create circuits or shortcuts outside the three-dimensional space, so assuming that there is a fourth dimension of space through which the different doors or portals that you create are connected. I'm also, again, maybe the last comment on that, I'm not assuming that we fully ever will be able to experience or live in such exemplifications. We might still be bound to bodily limitations, and that in the end might come down to some kind of perspective. But I think that computer games that make use of this possibility of simulating space in different ways can give us a great insight into the plurality of spatial concepts that we do find in philosophy, in physics, in math, or in cultural studies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for that very interesting lecture. May I now invite Ms. Elizabeth Bara to moderate the Q&A session.
Thank you. Good evening to everyone. I'm going to moderate this session. So before we begin, a few instructions for the participants. You can type in your questions in the chat box, or you can ask your questions directly by raising your hand. The button on the bottom of the screen indicates the same. While the speaker is speaking, a request to everyone to turn off your microphones. I will be only allowing one follow-up question. So let's begin.
There's already one.
Yes, Mr. Ravindra Wankede, please unmute and speak. Ask your question directly.
Good afternoon, sir. Namaste. Uh, are you able to hear me? Hello.
I can hear you. It's a bit choppy, but I hear you. Yeah.
Hello. Now. Hello.
Let's give it a try. Let's try.
Sir, you mentioned about Newtonian space. So can you after Newton, Einstein used that gravity to discover more about relativity. He used space, gravity, and time. So how they are related actually, space to time and gravity, sir?
Okay. Well, I'm only a philosopher, but the most productive period to spatial concepts was, to me, is prior Einstein, because until Einstein, people really wondered about the fourth dimension not being time, but being like an additional spatial dimension from which we might one day be possible to also witness space. But Einstein's concept is actually that you cannot separate space and time. And what we perceive, or what we call movement in Newtonian physics, is actually just a difference in gravitation. So this is, briefly speaking, as I understand Einstein, and how these three are connected. And yeah, maybe this could also be a great inspiration for a simulation. That whenever you move in space, it is only because of the physics or the gravitation is altered. But I myself do not know a computer game that actually is doing that.
Sir, can I ask one more?
Sure.
Yes, sure. Go ahead.
Sir, you mentioned about outer form and inner form in start of the lecture. Means outer
the outer space.
Outer space and inner space. So inner space, does it mean our related to the minds, or inner space is a kind of space when we have no thoughts, thoughtless state, like that?
Yeah, it's. Thank you for that question. So you can, the difference between inner and outer space, it varies simply. I don't think you're referring to that, but if we look at this Persian miniature and consider the inner space to being the inside of a building, then okay, this is probably the most simplest idea of inner space. But the way I referred to it in the very beginning was through Kantian philosophy. And Kant had this idea that where we perceive movement, that is the inner sense. And where we perceive extension, that is the outer sense. And the use of the term sense in the 18th century is not it's not a physiological meaning like later on. So he didn't think of it in terms of, okay, there might be an organ which we perceive movement or spatiality. But he separated the two in terms of inside outside, because I think that is his preoccupation. He believed that time is more closer to a living being because it includes movement, being animated. Right, the animals. So that's very definition of the soul. So that's probably he called it the inner sense. But somebody who gives us a very good deconstruction or criticism philosophy is Gaston Bachelard. So if you're interested in further conceptualization of that, I recommend the Poetics of Space by Gaston Bachelard.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ravindra, for your question, and thank you, Professor Günzel, for your response. We have a question in the chat box. I will just read it out to you. The question is by Miss Vidya. What would a non-representational or more than representational model of space look like?
Ooh, okay. Um, yeah. Vidya, hello, first of all, and I think just because of you, I am here today. So we probably would need to clarify what non-representational means. It is often used in philosophy, but also the social science, to describe the embodiedness of experience. So within Lefebvre, the perceived space would be a non-representational. And this, thank you, I didn't mention, to Lefebvre, these representational spaces, they actually go full circle in the end. So we have the perception of space, then a representation by which we also create spaces, and then they become culturally manifested. And then we again perceive those spatial constructs like the classroom or the prison, etc., etc. So the non-representational would be the embodied or the perceived space, and the more than representational might be the way in which space is exemplified, but probably I need additional information on what you mean by a more representational model of space.
Thank you, Professor Gwenzel, for your response. Thank you, Vidya, for your question. Anyone else wants to ask questions? Yes, Diksha, please unmute and ask your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for such erudite lecture. I want to ask a question regarding the political simulation games. So, how do the design choices made by game developers of political simulation games, particularly in the representation of political space, reflect the developer's understanding of the fluidity and multiplicity of political spaces?
Okay. Oh, that's a good but also tough question. So, if you're talking about non-computer based simulations, like the early decision-making games, or
Yeah, exactly, like the democracy series.
yeah. I'm not an expert for that, but what you usually do in those games is that you establish in sets and subsets of the population. So you come up with a certain model or understanding of politics, and then the game mechanics are adopting them. It's a very, let's say, diagrammatic, or in the terms of set theory, also a topological understanding of space. So it's not about a space of extension, but it's about a space of exclusiveness or inclusiveness. So who are the decision makers? Who is in charge? And the way those games are designed is that there is a particular people that have an access, then there are the gatekeepers. So you could say the political model itself is the game engine. And that also we can find in computer game simulations, like, for example, if one more or less political game is Civilization, but also SimCity that treats poverty, for example, in a very, very political way without being explicit about it.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you for the question. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Diksha, for your question. Yes, we have another question in the chat box, Professor. Here it goes. It's from the department. How do we differentiate between relational space and relative space?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's one of my favorite, not topics, but the one I have learned about myself a lot, because that is often confused, and I confused it myself as well when I started learning about spatiality. And usually the relativity of space is ascribed to Einstein. What we forget about is that already there is a definition of relative space in Newton, because Newton, he has this famous example to explain what he means with absolute space, is that in a relative space like a ship, for example, we might think of everything is in rest. When you are not looking at the horizon on a ship, everything stays in the same proximity to you. But if you look from outside onto that relative space of the ship, you can see that it is moving in what Newton then is calling the absolute space. So there's relative rest, relative movement, relative space, relative time, but also there's absolute motion, absolute space, absolute time in the concept of Newton. What Einstein then did is that he said, okay, what we call an absolute space is itself a relative space, namely relative to gravity or to time. This is how we use relativity nowadays. The idea of relational space is a completely different one, even though the terms sound so close or so alike. Relational space is, maybe let me share with you just one more slide, because that makes it easier to get. So if you, hope you can see it. If you think of modern subway maps, the space they describe or they represent to us is a space of connections, of places that are connected with each other. And this is a relational space. So the actual physical distance between the locations doesn't matter. It might matter time-wise, how long it takes to get again from A to B, but for you in the transport system, it's only important to know about the connections and the junctions. And this is a relational space. And it originates in the description of Leibniz and was first applied to real space by Gauss in this problem of Königsberg. And this is a different tradition, it's a mathematical tradition, whereas relativity coming from physics, from Newton, leading to Einstein.
Thank you, Professor, for your response. While others take time to post questions, I would like to I want some clarification. This is a very new topic for me, and I thank you for acquainting me with this topic. You talked about space as a form of intuition, a subjective form, but at the same time, it is. It's a subjective form, but it is same for everyone, not different from person to person. So, can you shed light on that little bit? Because it's a
Yeah,
subjective
sure.
form.
Yeah. So in its original way, I presented it with Immanuel Kant. It is the idea that he uses a term, what is a German term for what in English translates into mind. So mind is a very loose but also universal concept of human intellect. But above that, it also includes language, perception, whatsoever. So it's a very important, but again, loose term. And the human mind, that is something that you can say, okay, each of us has or shares human intellect or mind. But philosophers used to believe that we are not that different. We do share the way our mind is structured often is very similar. I know that in the 19th and 20th century, this has been challenged by linguistics a lot, because they say, okay, the very grammar we are using that preforms the mind or the intellect of people. And depending on the grammar structure that you are using, you probably have a different understanding of the world and a different mind or mindset. But apart from that, in this idealistic philosophy of Immanuel Kant, the subjectivity is something that we all share, but it is subjective because it is innate in the human mind and not something that is out there in the object world. That is how subjectivity here is used. If we move on to the 20th century, or let's see to Lefebvre, I didn't make that connection back to Kant, so thank you for giving me that chance. I would say this form of intuition, or the a priori form of space, is something that is collectively lived because of that set of spatial structures that we are in. So it's not anymore just a structure of our mind, but it's a way we constructed our life world in, let's say, political separation, architecture, accessibility to communication devices. But it is an a priori, because we usually just, as we don't think about the form of intuition, we usually also don't think about the structure of the cultural space that we are living in. But to cut a long answer short, subjectivity in the Kantian sense of the mind, or the form of intuition being subjective, is used, the term subjective, to make it not be an objective material item.
Thank you so much, Professor. Yes, there's a question from the department.
Hi, Professor. I'm Vidya.
Yes, Vidya.
Hello.
It's so nice to meet you finally. My next question is, could we say that the later Foucault of emplacements and of other spaces, he leans more towards perceived space because he gives more importance to spatial practice?
Yeah. So you mean like this text on other spaces, right?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. Actually, that also connects to one of my answers I gave on Bachelard, because Foucault starts his text with, okay, I'm not talking about what Bachelard is talking about. It's not about the imagination in poetics or literature about space. So it is about, cultural spatial practices. The core concept of his text on other spaces is heterotopia, or heterotopic places. So he considers all cultures to be constituted by institutions, you might call it, or by spaces that create a counterposition to regular spaces. And this difference creates or separates human from being just pure nature. That is just like, I think the idea is similar to Lévi-Strauss, who interprets the incest taboo as a self-distinguishing of humans from animals or from nature. Here it's much more, about cultural practices, about spaces that are perceived. One could try to also map this triad of Lefebvre onto Foucault. but Foucault has a different setup, so he has these different characteristics of what an heterotopia can be described as. But the juxtaposition or the hybridity sometimes of spaces, that is what is much more important for him. So one of his examples is the cinema, where you're located in one physical space, but you're looking at another imaginary space, or the fact that some countries or cultures like Brazil, they open spaces from the inside to the outside for travelers passing by, to not really let them into the house, but just to be to have guests or give them a place to rest. So they open a part of the house towards the outside for them to enter. And this is also an heterotopic place. And Foucault's claim is that heterotopic places constitute every culture. I don't know if that is the answer you were hoping for, but you can also clarify if that was going in the wrong
I was
direction.
asking it in the context that the early Foucault refers more to prisons and psychiatric hospitals, and you were saying, yes.
Okay, I see. Yeah, yes and no, because that text that was published in '84, as his last text, was actually already written in '67, before his studies of the prisons, or of madness and civilization. So, but when I read the text, to me, this is like the prelude, the opening to everything he has then done afterwards. Because he not only talks about the heterotopias, but he also talks about heterotopology as his method, meaning that he wants to describe cultures as spaces or spatial configurations. And I agree that his later, or the texts that were published for us earlier, they are more cool or more distant, less positive even, maybe. But I always read of other spaces as the prelude, the introduction to his whole oeuvre before it was even written.
Oh, thank you, Professor.
Welcome.
Thank you, Professor, for your response, and thank you, Ms. Vidya. Professor, we have time for just one more question, and there's one question in the chat box. Manya wants to ask, what is the relation of time and space?
Wow, yeah, that is. How much time do we got left? No. So,
Professor, yeah.
no, just joking. I'll try to make it short. So, the one thing is that in this classical idealistic philosophy, we see that the strict separation between time and space, and time being more closer to the inner self and space more towards the outside. That is one way to put it. The other one is then after 200 years or 250 years in the theories of relativity, it's brought back together. So that would be from Kant to Einstein. To me, and following Lefebvre, I would say time is something that is inscribed in space, or that is mediated to us only spatially, because we cannot separate or perceive movement separately from spatiality. Rather, I would say what people call time is actually something they witness spatially. And because of memory and projection, we assume that there is something like a timeline running, but that is just an abstraction for what we perceive spatially. And this is also one of the reasons why the spatial turn following Lefebvre focus so much on space only as a category and not on time, because they have so many abstractions happening in the 19th century with the invention of historical time, historicization in Hegel and other philosophers. We have to get rid of that, because they're just abstract models. Spatiality is what we actually should be thinking about. And yeah, I share that idea because also maybe this is my last hint or argument on that, is that at least in the languages I know, there is no original word for time. And also time itself means splitting, cutting, separating, which is a spatial operation. And this to me is another proof of time being merely an abstraction of space.
Thank you so much, Professor, for this response. And thank you, Manya, for your question. We have about 5 minutes left. If anyone wants to still ask a question, you may go ahead. Professor, yes. I think we can wrap up the Q&A now.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So if anyone wants to ask further questions, you can correspond with Professor Günzel through email, and the email will be provided in the chat box. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Professor, so much for your kind response.
Thank you for having me, and hoping for one day to meet you on Goa.
Thank you, Professor, for such enlightening session. And thank you everyone for being part of this session. Today's lecture has been recorded. The recording of today's lecture will be available at our YouTube channel, Philosophy at Goa University. We shall return soon with yet another captivating online guest lecture. Until our orbits intersect again, may curiosity be our compass. Have a pleasant evening. Thank you so much.